In 2019, CBS News reported Mr. Washington tried to add a $200,000 sauna to the LA Metro's employee gym after being presented with a more taxpayer-friendly $50,000 version. He proposed this lavish spending as city buses, quote, broke down and caught fire due to lack of money. The New York Times reported that a Denver rail project overseen by Mr. Washington ran up a $2 billion plus deficit and had become over 30 years behind schedule. Just last month, Mr. Washington and other Denver officials spent more than $100,000 on a junket to Africa to drum up support to Denver's airport. Government waste and delayed over-budget projects are things we want to change at the FAA, not continue. I'm also afraid that Mr. Washington's record suggests that he'd focus on virtue signaling at a time when the FAA needs to be laser-focused on aviation safety and modernization.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back. If you're new here, hit subscribe and ring the bell because we cover the stuff mainstream media tends to skip over. Today, we're reacting to Senator Ted Cruz's opening statement at the Senate confirmation hearing for Phil Washington, President Biden's pick to lead the FAA. I'll be honest, I came in with an open mind, but after watching this, Ted Cruz makes some points that are really hard to argue with. And this isn't a political thing for me. This is about whether the person running one of the most important safety agencies in the country is actually qualified to do the job. We're talking about an agency responsible for 2 million passengers every single day. So watch this clip carefully, pay attention to the specifics, and I'll be back after the full video with my complete breakdown. Let's get into it.
The FAA faces enormous challenges. It must modernize our airspace while safely integrating new entrants, like drones. It is trying to keep its reputation as the gold standard for aviation safety, while dealing with far too many close calls and operating an outdated air traffic control system that must safely move roughly 2 million passengers a day. To meet its mission, the FAA needs a Senate-confirmed leader with decades of experience in aviation to make certain that the flying public is safe, the agency's primary obligation. This obligation is so important that Congress mandated that the FAA administrator must, quote, have experience in a field directly related to aviation. The nominee before us, Phil Washington, had a long and honorable career in the military, but he does not have any experience in aviation safety. This, quite simply, is a position he is not qualified for. I'm disappointed that the administration has chosen to treat a critical safety position, a position keeping our families safe, they've chosen to treat it as a patronage job. As a result of the White House playing politics with the flying public safety, the FAA has lacked a Senate-confirmed leader for a year now. I expect we'll hear some members of this committee gloss over Mr. Washington's lack of aviation and aviation safety experience by saying he has a record of strong management of transit agencies. He understands buses, and isn't that good enough for planes? But his record demonstrates the opposite. The Democrat city transit agencies he's run have been beset by mismanagement and wasteful spending. In 2019, CBS News reported Mr. Washington tried to add a $200,000 sauna to the LA Metro's employee gym after being presented with a more taxpayer-friendly $50,000 version. He proposed this lavish spending as city buses, quote, broke down and caught fire due to lack of money. The New York Times reported that a Denver rail project overseen by Mr. Washington ran up a $2 billion plus deficit and had become over 30 years behind schedule. Just last month, Mr. Washington and other Denver officials spent more than $100,000 on a junket to Africa to drum up support to Denver's airport. Government waste and delayed over-budget projects are things we want to change at the FAA, not continue. I'm also afraid that Mr. Washington's record suggests that he'd focus on virtue signaling at a time when the FAA needs to be laser-focused on aviation safety and modernization. As LA Metro CEO, he said, quote, "Everything we do in terms of mobility, we look through the lens of equity." At the Denver airport, he's spending millions of dollars to build a special, quote, hall of equity and change the contract bidding process to place a heavier emphasis on so-called equity and so-called social cultural merits. Safety, not political posturing, needs to be paramount at the FAA. I also have serious concerns regarding outstanding allegations of misconduct going back to Mr. Washington's time at LA Metro. He was named in multiple search warrants in an ongoing criminal public corruption investigation and was the subject of multiple whistleblower complaints. One whistleblower who exposed details of a politically connected contracting scheme claims to have been retaliated against by Mr. Washington. After Mr. Washington went to Denver, LA Metro settled the claims for more than $500,000. And just last month, Mr. Washington was named in a discrimination and retaliation lawsuit filed by a former Denver airport employee. Mr. Washington failed to notify this committee of the lawsuit, one of dozens of omissions in his questionnaire, suggesting that he has been less than fully transparent and raising concerns about how he'll collaborate with us as we work to reauthorize the FAA. Finally, Mr. Washington, as a retired member of the military, needs a waiver from both the House and the Senate to be eligible to serve, since federal law explicitly requires that the FAA administrator be a civilian, and retired members of the military do not, under the statute, qualify as civilians. On 5 occasions, Congress has passed legislative waivers so that retired military personnel could serve at the FAA. We would do the same for Mr. Washington if his record merited it, if he had experience in aviation safety. But it doesn't, and if Senate Democrats force this nomination through without a waiver, a legal cloud will hang over every single FAA action. Let me close with a quote. Quote, "I have said that it is very important that in this day and age, when it comes to aviation, safety must always be our top priority. We've considered the nomination, the nominee's record, an ongoing case of whistleblower retaliation, and given all of that, it is clear to me that he is not the right person for the safety culture that we need today at the FAA." Those were the words spoken about a former FAA nominee by the chairwoman of this committee in 2019 about Steve Dixon, who had 40 years of aviation experience. Mr. Washington is not the right nominee for this position.
Okay, so we just watched that in full. And look, whether you're a Ted Cruz fan or not, you have to give credit where it's due. That was not a rant. That was a structured, evidence-based argument, and it deserves a serious look. Let me walk through what stood out to me. The qualification issue. Congress actually wrote into law that the FAA administrator must have experience directly related to aviation. That's not a preference, it's a legal requirement. And Phil Washington does not meet it. Phil Washington had an honorable military career and ran public transit agencies, but buses and trains are not planes. When a bus breaks down, you pull over. When something goes wrong at 35,000 feet, there's no pulling over. That he's a strong manager argument just doesn't cut it for a role like this. The management record. Even if you set aside the aviation experience question, the record Ted Cruz laid out is worth paying attention to. A proposed $200,000 sauna at LA Metro while city buses were breaking down and catching fire due to lack of funding. A Denver rail project over $2 billion over budget and 30 years behind schedule. A $100,000 trip to Africa. Look, big infrastructure projects often go over budget, and one foreign trip doesn't define a career. But when you stack these things together, a pattern starts to emerge, and it's not a flattering one. Equity versus safety. I know this is the most controversial part of Ted Cruz's argument, so I want to be fair here. I'm not saying equity doesn't matter, but the FAA has one core job, keeping people safe in the air. Phil Washington reportedly said that everything at LA Metro was viewed through the lens of equity, and at Denver Airport millions were going toward a hall of equity and equity-based contract bidding. Again, those aren't inherently bad values, but if you're leading the FAA and that's your primary lens, I think that's a genuine concern. The flying public just wants the plane to land safely. The misconduct allegations. This is the part that got the least media coverage, and honestly the part that bothered me most. Phil Washington was named in multiple search warrants in an active criminal public corruption investigation. There were multiple whistleblower complaints. One whistleblower who flagged a politically connected contracting scheme claimed retaliation, and LA Metro settled that claim for over $500,000. Then just before the hearing, Phil Washington was named in a discrimination and retaliation lawsuit by a former Denver airport employee, a lawsuit Phil Washington failed to disclose to the committee. Even if you think some of those allegations are politically motivated, not disclosing an active lawsuit to a Senate Oversight Committee is a transparency problem, plain and simple. The legal waiver. Federal law says the FAA administrator must be a civilian, and retired military members don't legally qualify as civilians under the statute. Congress has granted exceptions before, and Ted Cruz said they'd consider doing it again, but only if Phil Washington had the aviation experience to justify it. Phil Washington doesn't. So you've got someone who doesn't meet the experience requirement and needs a legal exemption on top of that. Without that waiver, every FAA decision under Phil Washington's leadership would be legally exposed. The closing quote. This was a smart move by Ted Cruz. He quoted the committee's own chairwoman from 2019, when she opposed a previous FAA nominee specifically on safety culture grounds. That nominee, Steve Dixon, had 40 years of aviation experience and still didn't clear the bar for her. Phil Washington has zero aviation experience. If the standard was that high for Steve Dixon, how is Phil Washington passing it? So that's my overall take. Ted Cruz wasn't grandstanding. He was doing exactly what a confirmation hearing is supposed to do, applying real scrutiny to a nominee for a role where the stakes are genuinely life and death. You don't have to like Ted Cruz to see that the questions he raised are legitimate. The FAA had been without a confirmed leader for over a year. Close calls in the skies were increasing, and the air traffic control system was already outdated. Phil Washington was the answer to all of that, and I just don't think that was good enough. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read all of them. If you found this useful, a like goes a long way. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a great time. See you in the next one.